Hello. I think that's my microphone. Well, no, my microphone's here. I'm not really sure how to go from slide to slide, so maybe There's a clicker on there. Is that my clicker? Yes. Okay, great. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Today, I'm going to talk about a very sort of vexed topic that's very close to my heart, which is trend forecasting, and specifically trend forecasting after the end of trends, which is the topic of this conversation today. And I'm one of the founders of Nemesis. Nemesis helps ambitious founders and organizations design for cultural complexity, and sometimes that cultural complexity involves a rapidly approaching uncertain future, so we call it trend forecasting. And I've been a quote-unquote trend forecaster for a really long time now, and it's become an increasingly complicated thing to perform as trends have become more and more popular and less legible, and it almost feels like meaning itself is being sort of evacuated from the idea of trends. So here are some of the people that we've worked with, and today we're going to talk about the end of trends. So our first sort of prediction of the idea of the end of trends came from a report that we wrote 5 years ago using, now in a way that probably seems quite quaint, GPT-3, which had just come out, and we actually needed to use it through a friend who had special access to it because it wasn't something that everyone could use. And basically, what we did with this report was interview a great number of people and conduct a great number of surveys about people's changing experience of time, because we had noticed that everyone was saying throughout their experience of COVID that time felt like it was slowing down or speeding up or becoming discontinuous. And so we did a number of surveys and interviews and then fed the responses of those interviews into GPT-3 and used it as a sort of demonic autocomplete. And it renamed our organization Doom, exclamation point, so we became the Doom Report. And one of the predictions that came out of this sort of collaboration with the machine was this idea of the end of trends. So it said that the fractal property of trends and prediction implies a metafractal perspective that made a few respondents uncomfortable, myself included. We may be witnessing the end of trends in general. Even what we may be witnessing as a new trend or paradigm may be a higher order statistical cluster or a continuing trend within a collapsing paradigm. So that prediction turned out to be very prescient indeed. And I'll get back to the Doom Report in a little bit, but for now we're actually going to go further back in time to Dante's Inferno and think about this image, which is from the 20th canto of Dante's Inferno. And in this portion of the text, Dante and Virgil are in a particular ditch, which is a particular circle of hell, where the astrologers and the soothsayers are. And the punishment for looking so far ahead in their lifetimes was that in their sort of hellish forever, their heads were turned on backwards and their hair was, instead of going down their backs, was going down their fronts, and they were stumbling forward while always being doomed to look backwards. And the sort of like incredible perversity of watching these mangled humans who are being kind of punished for reaching ahead to where God should really know better so moves Dante that he actually like breaks the fourth wall in this canto and says how it's like wrong to pity anyone in hell, but he actually pities the soothsayers and the astrologers. And it's actually really funny because in a lot of ways, I think that we are all in this sort of predicament at the moment. We're all trying to move forward while looking backwards and stumbling. While preparing for my sense of the end of trends, I returned to one of my earliest and most influential inputs in my life as a trend forecaster, which was the Gonzo Futurist Manifesto. And this was a PDF that was freely circulated online in 2011 and posited that there was a certain way of looking at the future that would help all of us be able to see what was coming in a time that was exceptionally volatile and uncertain, and in which filter bubbles were forming. Again, those filter bubbles now seem quaint compared to where we are now in our sort of like algorithmic media consumption. But the Gonzo Futurist Manifesto said that if you took after a certain character from literature, Case Pollard, who is very close to my heart, and you cultivated your own sensitivity and you picked up on weak signals and weak links in the world around you, you would be able to sort of like grok this uncertain future and prosper in a particular way. The literary theorist Lauren Berlant called Case Pollard from William Gibson's novel Pattern Recognition an empress of the amygdala because she's governed by her fear. So basically, the character in this book is a incredibly sought after and effective cool hunter who knows without knowing why whether something will work or not in a commercial setting. And in the book, she knows that because she has this incredible allergy to commercial brands and logos that comes from being traumatized by 9/11. And her biggest trigger is the Michelin Man. So this is actually like a really early Michelin Man that came from the stack of tires that the Michelin brothers saw at a, I think it was 1894 Great Exhibition in Lyon. And it became this figure, Bibendum, now it's time to drink, and this idea of Michelin tires as a sort of way to go explore the world and eat and drink, and this link between leisure, the sort of like burgeoning category of automotive leisure, and the actual tires necessary to get on the road to do that was all kind of put into this quite spooky, mummy-like pile of tires. So they said the art of motoring has just been born, and the tire is the essential organ without which the car cannot travel. So in a certain way, it makes sense that if you're going to be traumatized and triggered by commercial culture, this very scary character would be your ultimate trigger, because he's freaky, but also because he holds all of these sort of connections between something that becomes something else, like a way of connecting one form of commerce to another. The idea of the car to the tire, to the body, to the organs, to the drinking, to the leisure, to the new categories, to the future itself. And something that's really interesting about Pattern Recognition is that it's a sci-fi novel in which the novum, or the new technology that is the future-facing thing that doesn't exist in our world, is the brain of the protagonist. So the idea is that there's something about the mind of the protagonist, Case Pollard, that can intuit the wisdom of crowds in a better than random way, and that this is a sci-fi novum. This is the new thing. And this was one of the most inspiring and provocative things to me, especially when I was working on K-Hole, the trend forecasting report that I was a part of starting in 2010 and 2011. The idea that we could cultivate a certain type of sensitivity with our own minds that could process more than human amounts of information while still being human, and use our sort of human abilities to move forward in this crazy information environment. In the Gonzo Futurist Manifesto, this whole idea basically maps onto an OODA loop, so like a military format for understanding decision making, but like riffs on it to talk about how you can understand how to process information in this way and become the novum. And what's interesting about this loop, observe, orient, decide, and act, sounds reasonable enough. And what I'm kind of arguing here is that the observation point has gotten so complicated because we are in such a contaminated media environment, and it's becoming less and less relevant what you personally observe and the way that you connect the dots from what you see. So in the Gonzo Futurist Manifesto, the idea is that you kind of conduct an OODA loop by trusting your gut, the preconscious, and the unknown unknowns, the things that you don't know that you know. And I think I still fuck with that part. Blending new information with previous experience, you should look for links and pursue unexpected synergies. I think that we live in a world of unexpected synergies now, and that whole part has become a bit tainted, which is why I'm talking today about how to think about trend forecasting after the end of trends. Okay, but let's just back up a little bit and think about why people care about trends at all. So one very basic reason to care about trends is to plan an investment of time, money, energy, or attention. Another good reason or bad reason, depending on your perspective, is to front run other people. So my colleagues last year at this same event talked about what it means to be early, and being early and front running other people are intimately connected. Another very important and more emotional part of caring about trends has to do with feeling like you're a part of the moment in the world that you live in, and feeling like you understand where you are and understand the zeitgeist. Or, if that's not your thing, to understand it so that you can not do it and to feel separate from the moment. More importantly, perhaps, is what are trends at all? And I'll share a little bit about that in a minute. But if we actually just look at the sort of dictionary definition of trends, I think it's quite telling, because the way that trends have filtered into our world now kind of combines all of these things. So it's an inclination in a direction, it's a tendency, and it's a fad or a fashion style. And our contemporary understanding of trends really does combine all of those things. This is sort of the classic definition you're going to get from from the sort of like last 20, 30 years of how to be a trend forecaster. If you ask a kind of like canonical trend forecaster what a trend is, the definition usually is something like this. Trends are the direction or vector along which particular forces or agents of change travel. And Martin Raymond, who wrote the Trend Forecaster's Handbook and runs the Future Lab, is responsible for this exact one. You know, I used to go to some Future Lab briefings in New York when I was a young trend forecaster, and they would literally wear lab coats and do this like LARP of like being like these scientific gurus, and it was very, very campy. And trend forecasting is kind of campy because there's something fundamentally performative and like borderline unbelievable about knowing the future. And knowing the future is always a part of what we're doing when we're talking about trends. And knowing the future is potentially impossible, or if it is possible, you might end up in a ditch in hell with your head on backwards. But just to return to this definition of trends and the idea of a direction or vector along which forces travel, it speaks to this particular thing that we've been researching at Nemesis, and we're kind of putting some ideas together around, which is that trend forecasting in general is under this sort of long shadow of the idea of the diffusion of innovations model, which you can see a curve of here. And the diffusion of innovations model is Everett Rogers' model of how new things come into the world, and it was published in 1962. And the idea of crossing the chasm, which is very, very popular in technology marketing, which may be relevant to some people here, is also from this model. And what's really interesting about the lore behind the diffusion of innovations model is that Everett Rogers grew up on a corn farm in Iowa. He was born in 1931, I believe. And his father, supposedly, the story goes, was kind of down with like mechanical innovations for the farm, but not with the like biogenetic innovations for the farm, and wouldn't plant this new type of corn, and his crops failed. And they say that that's why Everett Rogers became interested in this idea of like who adopts a new innovation, why and how. And so in this model, this is where the term early adopters comes from. And it's sort of responsible for this cultural obsession with early adopters. And probably a lot of people here understand how being an early adopter is a complex state of being, to say the least. But in trend forecasting, the dogma has been that early adopters become an almost like spiritual carrier of the idea of early in general. And if you find these like certain people who are attached to the trends, they'll lead you to something else that's important. I think what's breaking down in the world that we're in now is that that's not really true. You might be incredibly early on one thing and hopelessly late on another, and the correlation is really breaking down. So let's return to the etymology, in this case, of trend forecasting, because it's kind of interesting. It really speaks more to the cyclical nature of things. It's from this root trendin, to roll about, turn, or revolve. And this idea of like rolling in a ball or a circle or a ring is like at the heart of the very idea. So we actually have like a few different mental models for the idea of trends. We have the vector, we have the curve, which we just saw in the diffusion of innovations model, we have the loop, which may be more true, we have the cycle, or we have the knot. And we're kind of, many of us, caught in the knot or the sticky web of trends at the moment. And a big reason for that is that our powers of observation are troubled by the fact that the information environment that we're in is so corrupted and so overloaded. And now we're facing the onslaught of machines that do pattern recognition in a black box way at a speed that is very difficult for human beings to interact with, despite what you might be hearing online with all of like the Chads bragging about how they're front-running everyone else by using agents and AI in these particular ways. It's still a learning curve for everyone, and we're kind of on the precipice of an even more complex and muddied information environment, which is why we need to reassess how we think about what innovations are, what it means to be early in the present or late, and how things diffuse culturally. So in the past, the idea was if something seems incongruous, it's probably important. And I would argue now that so many things are incongruous that this link between incongruous and important is less important than it ever was. Same for the idea that you can seek out and extrapolate from anomalous change, because we live in the world of anomalous change. Last year, we talked about how trends in a certain way are a form of inefficiencies. You know, things still happen. You can be early and you can be late to them, but earliness is a decreasingly relevant way for an entity to relate to its audience. So once front-running other participants in markets or in cultural production becomes a common strategy, which it has in a lot of cases, trends become a form of inefficiency, temporary blips of difference or spikes in value that are bound for correction. So being early as a meta is replaced by catching people offsides, betting on the return to the mean. Lately, I've been researching remote viewing and thinking about what it might mean to access things that we have no proper, visible, earthly connection to. So this image is from Ingo Swann, who's an artist and researcher who developed the controlled remote viewing program in the US military, and is an interesting character, not without his complications. But what remote viewing is, as a practice, is using your human mind to go somewhere and see and gather intelligence and information about something that you have no reasonable or earthly access to. So like getting into the mind of Saddam Hussein, or in the middle of a particle that's being split in a nuclear reactor, and then using that as an intelligence gathering practice. And I think that while those exact examples might be a little bit far-fetched for something as banal as trend forecasting, the idea of thinking about how we can get out of the limitations of our own minds and reach into something else is very important. Back briefly to the Doom report and some of the ideas that came up there, which in a way I think are more telling than ever now that we've had 5 years to kind of process them. So one of the ideas that GPT-3 kind of spat out based on our time research data was this idea of quantum koinonia. So koinonia is a Greek word that translates to fellowship, communion, or sharing. It's in the Bible a lot, and it signifies a close relationship and shared participation, often within a religious or community context. And the idea in the report was that quantum koinonia was this idea of sort of like collective entanglement, where you're extending your own mind into a small group where a number of individuals' minds are bound together at the quantum level or even at the collective level. It also kind of proposed the idea of distributed autonomous minds. So in the report, there was this concept that we're evolving into a cluster of connected devices that are part of a global mind, which almost seems like a very 90s statement to me, but with the idea of this sort of new information and environment, or even quantum koinonia, try it in a sentence, might be kind of a way of looking at an expanded consciousness that might speak to the future of how trend forecasting might really work. Another place that I've been returning to is one of my favorite books, which is Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. And in that book, there is an envoy from a sort of like league of planets going to a particular planet to find out if that planet will join this big league of planets. And on that planet, there is this group of people, the foretellers, who perform this very like odd to the protagonist practice of being able to divine questions, answers to questions that they have no sort of like reasonable access to. And it involves kind of becoming part of this one group hive mind and sharing energy and sharing consciousness in the group. And the weaver is the one who kind of takes in all the energy and then breaks it and kind of runs a form of a different and more illegible but more true form of pattern recognition than the old kind. So that's why you're the weaver, the one who can keep the tensions and responses of the group running in a self-augmenting pattern until the strain breaks the pattern itself and you reach through for your answer. I keep also coming back to this quote from Jodorowsky because it's one of the earlier things that I came across in my journey of thinking about divination and thinking about trend forecasting and thinking about how to put your mind into the future. And this one kind of keeps us in check, I think. It keeps us from being like the Dante's Inferno soothsayers with our heads on backwards. You must not talk about the future, he writes. The future is a con. The tarot is a language that talks about the present. If you use it to see the future, you become a con man. You are just a charlatan. For me, the tarot was something more serious. It was a deep psychological search. When you work with the tarot, you see that chance exists, synchronicity exists, and everything is linked, but nothing is a matter of probability. So when we're surrounded by probability machines, it's interesting to think about that perspective. And I'll just leave you with this one kind of question. Are you going to be someone who becomes basically a novum, a machine-like thinker, one who's a better-than-chance oracle in a human body, or are you going to be one who enriches the present and makes it better in the moment? Thank you so much. And if you would like to read more of our writing on culture and trend forecasting, you can find us at nemesisglobal.substack.com, and that's our website, Nemesis Global. If you want to reach out to me, this is where you'll find me. And I'm happy to see some faces in the audience from our autonomous strategy and writing workshops. We have other workshops starting this fall, so please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much. Bye.